Sorry about that. And I apologize. Last time I was here, something happened in the larger world, and I got all upset about something like a shooting. I won't do that today. That's hardly in the news anymore, buried in the back page. And I had been concerned as I'd been in Maryland and was flying here about what the progress of Dorian would be, and was delighted to find that I'm here at exactly the right time for my sermon, because the state of the hurricane is that it is threatening us without being here yet, right? Perfect place for me to speak to the invasion of the zombies, because most of you probably think that the zombies aren't here yet either. Most of you probably think that they're not even on the radar, but we'll speak today about some of the ways that they're very much on the radar. So I speak to you of a threatening storm, of a time when nature's powers are threatening us and human acts just get shunted aside in the news in times like these sometimes. What do zombies have to do with that? I want to suggest that the invasion of the zombies is one of the more important phenomena of our times, as reflected in popular culture, which is not just trivial stuff. We think it's trivial stuff because we are wiser and better educated than the usually young audiences who imbibe in such commodities in large quantities, who play video games and read comic books and watch B-movies while we're studying greater, more adult undertakings, right? But popular culture, through the ages and for whatever age range, is almost always a reflection of our popular psyche. And certainly, if whole generations are caught up in a phenomenon, not just like a fad, we're not talking Pokemon Go here, but for long periods of time, as I'll argue is the case with zombie phenomena, that can indicate something about the world that those people live in and ways that we experience our worlds, ourselves, and our possibilities as human beings alone and or together. In culture, in the breakdown of culture, as individuals, as survivalists, as tribes, or perhaps something larger and more fulfilling than that, but only perhaps. So I speak to these things today in speaking of the invasion of the soul-sucking postmodern zombies. I'll use as my frame of reference for you all some classic zombie movies. Incidentally, in the great punk rock video we just saw of I Walked with a Zombie, all the clips were from Night of the Living Dead, which is maybe the definitive early modern zombie film. But I actually want to say a little more about the film I Walked with a Zombie. It wasn't the first zombie movie. As I understand it, the first real zombie movie in the Western canon of great films is White Zombie in 1932 with Bela Lugosi, which was based on William Seabrook's The Magic Island. And it was set in Haiti, which white people were using voodoo to do their own trouble to each other. The movie I Walked with a Zombie, set in the tropics in Saint Sebastian, involved a Canadian nurse who volunteered to take on the care of a particular patient at that time, and it's set in a context that's inseparable from white colonialism, racism, and even slavery. I wrote down, as I watched the film this past week, I wrote down some dialogue where the driver of the carriage that the nurse is in, is she's impressed by this beautiful island and is riding out to the plantation where she'll be staying. He's speaking of a character, and she doesn't understand who this character is, and he speaks up, and the enormous boat brought the long ago fathers. This is her black driver speaking. And the enormous boat brought the long ago fathers and the long ago mothers of us all, chained to the bottom of the boat. He's speaking of a figure that was the figurehead on this slave ship that stands in the garden with arrows in it. And she says, "They brought you to a beautiful place, didn't they?" which is, I think, how most of us ought to think about slavery. I mean, it's certainly John Calhoun's view of slavery as a positive good. If you say, miss, if you say, he says with a smile. So I think you cannot understand that zombie movie without hearing those lines. They brought you to a beautiful place on a slave ship. And it's set in the islands, which would not have been the habitat of white Canadian nurses or plantation owners. And so in the earlier zombie movies of the American canon, the themes of those movies are for individual zombies. It's not yet the zombie apocalypse. It's what I would call modern zombie movies adopting Haitian culture and adopting the voodoo that is not in any way part of traditional Western culture or traditional Western literature. We have our Frankensteins, we have science-created monsters, but voodoo is Haitian. Voodoo is from Africa, ultimately. Voodoo of the kind we'll speak to is the other. It's alien to our classical Western traditions, and it represents a perversion of the natural order of things where only God or Jesus can raise the dead. The voodoo priest can as well, it appears. So in that film, I Walked with a Zombie, that's beautifully filmed in black and white. The director, Jacques Tourneur, also directed Cat People and does a great thing that Freud or Jung could appreciate by playing off the psychodynamics of the people involved. In this case, we have two stepbrothers. The stepbrother has at least desires for the wife of the other brother, and it's that wife who becomes a zombie, and meanwhile the mother of both brothers is lurking behind the scenes as the apparently rational person who turns out to have been behind the zombie phenomena from the start. So there are all sorts of dynamics, as we find in many horror movies. The external, the exciting, the dramatic, the catchy zombie type stuff, the monsters, become a vehicle through which what we're really looking at are human relationships, right? The kinds of things of guilt and jealousy and revenge that play out in our ordinary lives so, if not typically, at least frequently, if we look to a large enough scale. But the great modern zombie film, the one that is modern in a more real sense and almost postmodern, I believe, is George Romero's 1968 Night of the Living Dead. How many of you have seen Night of the Living Dead at some point? A lot of you have seen that. You may recall that by the time we get to the end of the movie, there's only one person left who has survived that zombie attack from that we've been following through the course of the movie. One of our protagonists is left. A black man who has shown great resilience and resourcefulness and has worked with other people, all of whom end up dead along with him, sometimes through their disagreements, sometimes through acts of bravery, sometimes through random events. But in any case, he's the one who's left. And at the end of the film, he hears dogs. What a welcome sign. Well, so much better than zombies. Any young black man in 1968 would have loved to hear the sound of barking dogs and the gunshots of the sheriff's department. It's not Mississippi, it's set in Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, outside, there are all kinds of zombies who are still left. And the hunting party, the search and destroy mission, as it's characterized by the news person who's speaking to this as the sheriff's and his deputies are walking through there. It's a search and destroy mission. They're picking off the zombies. They're building a bonfire. They're going to burn all the zombies. And one of them sees some movement in a house. Pew! I got him. And thus our protagonist is shot by the sheriff and ends up on a hook and then a bonfire in this greatest of zombie movies. I'm sorry if I gave anything away. I probably should have said spoiler alert. Romero made his movie 5 months after Martin Luther King was assassinated. If I Walked with a Zombie is almost predicated on colonialism, slavery, and the ingrained racism, it seems to me that Night of the Living Dead can hardly be divorced from its social context. In fact, George Romero said that part of what motivated him to make that movie was a sense of frustration with where society was going and with what he characterized as the failure of the 60s to accomplish some of the changes that Kevin quoted from Bobby Kennedy's remarks there. So in that movie, which was incidentally shown in some urban theaters on a double bill with Slavery, or Slave, no, it was Slave, exclamation point, which was of a slave uprising. And by at least one account, Night of the Living Dead was shown in a lot of urban cities on first release as part of a double header with Slave, about a slave uprising, yeah. What happened with the Night of the Living Dead, the reason so many of us have seen it, when they changed the title from Night of the Flesh Eaters, they made a technical mistake that left off the copywriting and it entered public domain, which meant that, like It's a Wonderful Life, it could be shown all over the place. And that's part of the reason that it went viral in our culture. That's part of the reason that zombie-like, it could spread like an infection through our viewing and inhabit our life world and our cultural world. Romero's follow-up to that goes beyond the individual zombies of the past, goes beyond the horde of zombies that are closing in on this little group of people, goes beyond the theme of race to a larger theme of consumerism. Much of the most important action of Dawn of the Dead is set in a shopping mall. Dawn of the Dead came out in 1978 when there were fewer shopping malls than there were 20 years later. There was still a widespread phenomenon, but it wasn't quite the trope that it would become. And so, in a way, establishing that, as I understand that plot, in Dawn of the Dead, one of the things that happens early on, once the zombies have attacked, once civilization has completely broken down, or almost completely broken down, in one housing project, mind you, the people there are defying martial law and refusing to hand over their dead for appropriate containment measures. So the police have to go in and raid that housing project and kill the residents that are refusing to abide by martial law. So that's, again, part of the setting for the cultural engagement with the zombies. The remaining forces of civil order are taking the responsibility for containing the threat. Yet some individuals in poorer neighborhoods are refusing to comply. So we do what we have to do. When survivors of this reach the malls, there's a great exchange in there that I'll get to just a little later on, but they really enjoy being in the mall. They're not zombies yet, and so they're picking up stuff. Hey, you want a fur coat? While we're here. But unfortunately, nomadic bikers, biker gangs, break down the barriers and let zombies in. So now we've got everything we need for a full-fledged spectacle. We've got bikers, we've got zombies, and we've got decent people being consumed by consumerism, right? That's Dawn of the Living Dead. I think Dawn of the Living Dead fully brings us to the postmodern era. Everything's broken down except consumerism, and we've got the different agents and actors at cross purposes, sometimes comic, sometimes tragic, sometimes with individual resonance, sometimes speaking to larger themes. So as I move forward from the particulars of the movies to what we're talking about, that's the best transition I can offer you from the older to what I consider the postmodern zombie invasion. Newer zombie movies, as I understand them secondhand, because I confess I've seen very few newer zombie movies. I watched Zombie Shark last night. It was the only one I could find at the last minute. And for all its great cinematic values, the story, the character, the dialogue, everything else, it was so perfect about it, I somehow didn't find great grist for further intellectual thought. You'd think zombie sharks would, anyway. In newer zombie movies, often we're shown a collapse of civilization. The Walking Dead has been a popular television show coming from the comic books. In The Walking Dead, for instance, as I understand it, again, because I somehow haven't been caught up in the television as much as I ought to from a cultural and ethical point of view. In The Walking Dead, often what's at issue are not the zombies, but the remnants of humanity fighting with each other, the tribes, the sense of what do human beings do when everything's broken down. We can see, in many cases, I would think from the descriptions, we can see how this becomes a great place in which to play out little dramas and larger dramas of human interaction, right? In that world, life has become what the philosopher Thomas Hobbes cautioned against. It's become the state of nature. Authority has broken down. There are no longer people to go out and shoot the ones who are defying martial law in the housing projects. We no longer have a pope. We no longer have a president. We no longer have a dictator. And the worst thing, according to the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who wrote in the early modern era, was a materialist and very impressed with the science of mechanism and organisms, the worst thing is to have no order at all, because then we're thrown back on nature, which is a struggle of all against all. And many of these zombie movies, television shows, comic books, video games represent exactly that. In a war of all against all, what does one do? And so often, if we think to how the brain is organized and how the amygdala is so much more fundamental than our cerebral cortex, right? Fear is the motivator. Security is the goal. You might think to the psychologist Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, the very first thing to take care of is our fundamental physical security. So it's us against them. And in that tribalistic context, we can see how I might use that from a creative point of view to mirror motifs in our society where some people aren't entirely comfortable with Muslims in America, equating it with the breakdown of our culture and the imposition of Sharia law, right? Some people aren't entirely comfortable with immigrants or even people who are fleeing oppression from, say, Central American countries who go through Mexico to get to the one where they might end up. But maybe I'm playing with that in a way that critiques underneath the surface. Maybe what I'm doing is showing that tribalism is not the answer. Or maybe what I'm doing is pumping those hormones up, playing to that amygdala, telling you if you want to make this country extremely good again, you want to think like a survivalist. You want it to be us versus them, and the tribe comes first. So, different ways creatively we can engage that. Again, I won't speak to the particulars as much in the details because I apologize for being rather ill-informed about the more contemporary zombie things. But I do think that they speak to our place in history. And I want to begin my references to history moving forward from here and analyzing from a line in Fight Club. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. Interesting way to think about a generation without place. And that's a little before, I think, the big rise of the zombie stuff. In the 1990s, there were 46 zombie movies made, by one count I saw. It's a fair amount. In the aughts, the years 2000 to 2010, 9, I guess, it went from 46 movies the previous decade to 172. It's a pretty big jump, roughly quadruple. And so when I think about why are zombie movies popular, what's going on with that? I did what any responsible 14-year-old researcher would do. I surfed the internet. Why are zombies popular? Type that into Google and see what comes up. So here's some of the stuff I found, only I rearranged it and put it into an order that is less random then I should give it to you, and if I were an authentic and well-researched 14-year-old. Simon Pegg, who directed Shaun of the Dead, which was a satirical take on Dawn of the Dead, and which really is one of, again, I haven't yet seen it, though that's been on my list for a long time, one of the apparently brilliant zombie movies, says, "The zombie trumps all by personifying our deepest fear, death. Zombies are our destiny writ large, slow and steady in their approach, weak, clumsy, often absurd. The zombie relentlessly closes in, unstoppable, intractable." And I think that's just a wonderful observation about death, as clumsy and absurd and slow but intractable. And so at the most fundamental level, perhaps, what the zombie represents is death, and so what the horde of zombies represent is all of us dying, all of us in our mortality being slowly encroached upon by a death that doesn't come just to the individual, even if we each die alone, as some have said. Another perspective is from the online journal Quora. Why are zombies so popular? One response is that they provide a good allegory for forces outside a person's control. Sometimes death comes at us in ways we have no control over, but there are all kinds of things that threaten us. Again, the mass shooting is a really good example, but the storm as well. All the different threats and things that intervene in our life. Think of the many, many things we don't control. Now, take yourself out of your adult life, and you're imagining now that you go to middle school. There's a whole lot more that you don't control, right? Another perspective that I saw is that to live in a zombie world, to be faced with an attack of zombies, to be living in a zombie apocalypse, is to experience and to have that mirror feelings of alienation from a social world. If I feel like I don't fit in at all, if I feel like the world is different from me, to represent that whole social world in terms of zombies would, again, dramatize the way that I feel not only left out, but threatened, and how could I possibly stand up to them? Another perspective I thought was really interesting. Why are zombies so popular? Because the mindless mob is the most terrifying monster there will ever be. Wow. And Night of the Living Dead really does that at the end of the movie, among other things. The mindless mob is the most terrifying monster there will ever be. Who's the monster in Frankenstein? Is it the doctor? Is it the Frankenstein monster? Is it the mob with the pitchforks and the torches? Another perspective on why zombies are popular is that those films and comic books and video games speak to ordinary people like me, or like a 14 or 17-year-old. Ordinary, straggling survivors, just like I am. Same issues as we have in life, but writ large and dramatized. Who do I trust? Should I cooperate with other people? Should I go it alone? Where do I make my stand? And if in a zombie apocalypse I'm choosing my weapons and deciding between the mall and the hardware store and some other sets of different things, I might be deciding who to sit with in the cafeteria. I might be deciding how I'm going to walk from this locker to that class to avoid a bully or something of that kind. And so in a zombie scenario, for many people who may not feel much control over their world, it gives me the fantasy of having a very simple adversary and having the agency to be able to fight back or to choose what I'm going to do. I don't have to mediate it. It's all stripped down. The social stuff has gone away. It's primal. It's me against this. And so now I play out my choices, my values, my hopes, my preferences. At a larger level of theory about what's going on in our culture, the zombie motif really fits different perspectives on who we are and what's wrong with us and what we need and where we might go. Many of you have at least some familiarity with the intellectual genius Noam Chomsky, who did tremendous stuff with grammar and with language and with social structure, but who has written 40 years worth of great stuff that in part has to do with the motifs that come out in The Dawn of the Dead with the shopping mall. So I thought I could read a couple of pages of Noam Chomsky to you just straight from the original, or I could read you from Critical Cactus, which is an online thing that makes the same point in a few words in a way that's more contemporary. We are the zombies. We have been bitten by the capitalist system. We are the mindless, apathetic beings shuffling and ravenous for nutrition-ridden food, shallow TV programs, and stuff we don't need, while not giving, I mean caring. While not caring, we'll just say that since it's here rather than somewhere else. So, the same thing that post-Marxist intellectuals or neo-Marxist intellectuals, latter-day left-wing people are arguing is social critique, comes out from the perspective of younger people and people who are writing edgier blogs and things as well, in a sense of, look at this society we're living in. Capitalism equals consumerism equals that stuff in the shopping mall where the zombies are attacking. We are the zombies. From the left, we have that critique, but there's a critique too from the right wing, or what might be called the reasonable right, as it was described in a Washington Post editorial in today's paper. I want to read you just a little bit from Jordan Peterson, because this is really, to me, important stuff. This is kind of my cultural sparring partner right now. This guy sold a lot of books. He puts a lot of people in the seats. Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos. And so part of what Peterson is arguing is that we live in a culture where the old meanings and order have broken down. And there's a problem with that. But where the authorities of learning in our higher education, in our universities, are preaching political correctness and multiculturalism and are tearing down the values that made this country great. In other words, while someone like our president is touting the importance of our country returning to values and traditions and identities that we've lost, this is an intellectual talking about how our intellectual communities have lost faith in, lost track of, and have turned our backs on the very meanings of those intellectual traditions from his point of view. He says, of course, culture is an oppressive structure. He's speaking against the people who get all upset about patriarchy and things like that. Of course, culture is an oppressive structure. It's always been that way. It is a fundamental, universal, existential reality. The tyrannical king is a symbolic truth. Culture is the necessary discipline and constraint within which we can practice our freedom and find our differing or converging beliefs about truth and such, values and such. Okay, so of course culture is coercive. So I want to read you just a little bit of what he says about the church and the demise of the church, and see if you can find any zombie language in this, okay? So that's your assignment as I read this half a paragraph from him. Listen for zombie language. The dogma of the church was undermined by the spirit of truth that the church itself helped develop. That undermining culminated in the death of God. But the dogmatic structure of the church was a necessary disciplinary structure. A long period of unfreedom, adherence to an interpretive structure of church dogma, is necessary for the development of a free mind. Christian dogma provided that unfreedom, but the dogma is dead, at least to the modern Western mind. It perished along with God. What has emerged from behind its corpse, however, is something even more dead, something that was never alive, even in the past. Nihilism, and an equally dangerous susceptibility to totalizing utopian ideals, by which he means fascism and Marxism. Nihilism, that is an attitude that there are no values, that nothing means anything. What Jordan Peterson is telling us most deeply and most tellingly in his book is that the demise of authority over meaning turns loose the zombie of postmodernism itself, nihilism. Now, I could go into all kinds of theoretical digressions about that, but I want to just focus on one because I take it to be the most revealing. He singles out the theorist and philosopher Jacques Derrida, who's a favorite of mine. I studied, it's in my dissertation. Jacques Derrida is quoted by Jordan Peterson as saying that everything is interpretation. There's nothing outside the text. There's no meaning independent of writing of text. And all that is in a way true of reading Derrida. That there isn't a single true meaning of a text. Everything is open to interpretation, okay? So what Jordan Peterson takes from that is, and what he objects to, he says, that does not mean that all interpretations are equally valid. So, of course, Derrida doesn't say that, but suppose he had, that would be a bad thing to say, right? All interpretations are equally valid. It's one thing if you're talking about a poem, it's another if you're talking about an international treaty, right? So the way he sums that line of argument up in talking about the universities is to say, why do we teach our young people that our incredible culture is the result of male oppression? There's other stuff about multiculturalism and that kind of. Why do we say this is a matter of male oppression? They also directly promote a radical political action. And he even gives an example of that. You may think he's being an alarmist, but this is real stuff, okay? If you're afraid of zombies, listen to this. This is a fact. The Pauline Jewett Institute of Women's and Gender Studies at Ottawa's Carleton University encourages activism as part of their mandate. Okay? That says it all to me. Encouraging activism. Bring on the zombies. We're dead. I'm having some fun with that, of course, but you can see, if you've ever heard me speak before, that this is not the way I look at the world, right? He's got brilliant things to say. He's got practical things to say. But he's got this thing going on that's a resentment of multiculturalism, of feminism, of Black Lives Matter, of all sorts of movements that want to take the values of our traditional Western culture and expand them to include people who haven't been included yet, which is sort of how I look at what we do in our Unitarian Universalist way. So I've given you a left slant, I've given you a right slant, but what to me is important, again, is the popular culture, is the popular psyche. This is the world we live in. And the horror genre, for me, reflects a state of terror. There were horror movies, there were horror films. I loved monsters when I was a kid. I ate them up. But I think the rise of the zombies, the invasion of the zombies, is triggered by a state of terror. I don't think it's an accident that after 2001, zombie movies became more and more prevalent. 9/11 is something that everyone in high school and beneath the high school level has had their whole lives lived under that shadow. People not much older than that, people in college, how old were they when 9/11 happens? Generations have grown up in the wake of the fall of the Twin Towers and in the wake of our response to that. Teenagers don't really want to get their driver's licenses like they used to really want. When I was a kid, man, God, bring it on. I'll have the independence. Teenagers aren't dating as early as they used to. It's as if teens have been more reluctant to enter the world of adult responsibilities. As if, I say, because I haven't analyzed all the data, but I think there's something to that. Some of the great newer generation postmodern zombie films, at least by reputation. In 2002, Resident Evil came out as a movie, being based on a video game that predated it by 5 or 6 years. 28 Days Later is one of the most recognized films of that genre. In 2003, the comic The Walking Dead debuted. 2004, we saw a remake of Dawn of the Dead that was very successful, and also the Shaun of the Dead that I referred to earlier. The fear. After 9/11, we've had the increasing rise of mass public shootings, shootings in schools from kindergarten up. We've seen an increased awareness of our planet's impinging death. And meanwhile, young people could look for examples of civil discourse and rational argumentation to people of my generation. And what might they see? They might see pissing contests that have accomplished nothing. They might see that we haven't limited guns in any significant way. We haven't slowed global warming in any significant way. What we may have done, we may have forestalled any number of possible incidents of international terrorism. We may have, through our homeland security and measures which are arguably more important than our constitutional liberties, we may have gained some measure of personal safety, but it's hard to even be aware that we've gained that when it's all secret. Meanwhile, domestic terrorism, hate crimes, things that are driven from a different ideological, homegrown terrorism has risen during that same generation. So perhaps in an age of homeland security, we are most insecure because now the threats come from within more than from outside. We don't know who the other is if they are not wearing Muslim garb, if they're not a different color even. How do I know which white person is going to pull out a gun and shoot the place up, right? A little harder to know how to deal with that when the threat could come from anywhere. Harder indeed. So I want to suggest that the zombie film takes the other, and it takes this environment in which, yes, meaning has broken down. Yes, there's some truth in what he's saying about the need for some sense of discipline within which we find our freedom. All these things breaking down. But what a world in which to play with our values, to resist with a sense of agency, to discover what is most meaningful and important to us, to enable people of younger ages who may not have a way in their real world of learning mastery in the same sense that we did, of riding their bicycles for a couple of miles and just checking their worlds out. In the land of the dead, a character says about the zombies, they're pretending to be alive. And the protagonist replies to that, isn't that what we're all doing? Pretending to be alive? On the back of Walking Dead comics, the comic book, there's a long list of stuff that starts out about, how much TV are we watching, and it ends with this. In a world ruled by the dead, we are forced to finally start living. In a world ruled by the dead, we are forced to finally start living. Survivors of war come back to society, have often experienced that the intensity, the depth of camaraderie in combat, that there's a vividness and aliveness in that experience that they don't know how to move on from. They're deprived of that sense of aliveness, but they have nightmares that are the afterward haunting. The aliveness is no longer alive, but it's not buried either. People who've come back from Iraq, people who came back from Vietnam, people who came back from World War I, I've heard stories of my own family, would have an experience of post-traumatic stress very often that was a kind of zombie state where something alive could not be buried, and it was there without being alive. My fear is that many of our children and grandchildren are experiencing something like that without ever having left home, except perhaps to go to school. What if the world we live in involves such a state of terror that we haven't really understood what it means to grow up in our world, much less how those of us with greater agency, greater adult powers, greater adult decision-making options might do something to make this a more habitable world? Not just in terms of our physical environment, but in terms of the culture, which is where we ought to be able to come together, where we ought to be able to share values and meanings and what's important, what we want to be able to pass on in a healthy, protective, safe way to generations to come. So rather than me saying what we need to do, you know what we need to do. I want my closing words to be from that Walking Dead comic. In a world ruled by the dead, we're forced to finally start living. Let's think about that and think about how each of us wants to live. Thank you very much.